The night sky was always the same above the lands of Greece, dotted with countless stars, moving slowly in their eternal paths, steady and patient as though they had been painted across the heavens for the sole purpose of guiding those below. When the people of the ancient world looked upward, they did not see only cold light. They saw patterns, connections, the outlines of stories, and the whispers of gods who lived both above and within their own hearts. For them, the sky was a canvas, and the earth was a stage, and the seas that surrounded their world were endless mysteries that invited both awe and respect. In such a world lived Odysseus, a man remembered not for strength alone but for his mind, his patience, and his unyielding determination. Yet the story of Odysseus, though told often with drama, can also be seen as a quiet river of moments, flowing steadily onward, winding gently through both calm and storm. Tonight, we followed that river, not with urgency but with ease, allowing each detail to linger like the sound of waves brushing against the shore. Imagine, for a moment, the island of Ithaca, Odysseus's home. The hills are gentle, not towering mountains but soft ridges that catch the golden light of dawn. Olive trees stand in small groves, their silver-green leaves whispering in the breeze, and narrow paths curve along the slopes where goats graze calmly. At the edge of the land, cliffs fall into the sea, where the water shifts between deep blue and shimmering green, depending on the hour. Ithaca is not a grand place, but it is steady, familiar, and grounding. It is the kind of place where one's heart rests, a harbor in both reality and memory. For Odysseus, it was the anchor to which his life was tied, no matter how far the winds would carry him. The tale begins after the war at Troy, a war that had raged for many long years and left both victors and vanquished weary. The city had fallen at last, not through brute force, but through cunning, through a plan that Odysseus himself had devised. That famous wooden horse, filled with warriors, is remembered as one of the cleverest tricks in story and song. Yet what is often told with excitement and grandeur, we may picture here in softer colors. The horse stands quiet in the night, wheels resting against the stones of Troy's gate, its wooden frame gleaming faintly beneath torchlight. The city sleeps, believing the war is over, and in that stillness, Odysseus's plan unfolds. It is not the crash of battle that lingers for us tonight, but the stillness before dawn, the silence that holds its breath before change arrives. When the war was ended, and the victors prepared to return home, Odysseus longed for Ithaca. He longed for the hills, the olive groves, the familiar coastline, and for his wife, Penelope, who waited with quiet faith, and his young son Telemachus, who had grown while he was away. Yet the journey from Troy to Ithaca would not be a straight path across calm waters. It would be a voyage stretched across years, across challenges, across tests of patience and resilience. But as we follow it now, we do so not as if rushing through trials, but as if walking through a garden where each step is unhurried and each sight is worthy of pause. The ships left Troy under skies that were vast and open. Picture the sails catching the wind, pale canvas swelling gently, ropes creaking with the movement. The sailors' hands worked with familiarity, guiding their vessels as they had done many times before. The sea beneath them shimmered, broken here and there by the curve of a wave or the leap of a fish. Odysseus stood upon his deck, not shouting commands but watching, quietly, as the horizon widened before him. His thoughts were steady, turned always toward Ithaca, though the road, or rather, the sea, would prove winding. As days turned to nights, and back again. The rhythm of travel was one of constancy. The oars dipped into the water, rising and falling in harmony. The wind shifted, sometimes strong, sometimes faint, but always present. The sky guided them, sun by day and stars by night. The sailors spoke softly among themselves, telling stories to pass the hours, singing songs that carried lightly across the waves. In these small details, one sees the shape of life aboard a ship, not only adventure, but also the calm persistence of ordinary hours, the kind of hours in which minds wander and dreams form. Yet the gods were always part of the world of Odysseus, not distant but interwoven. Some favored him, others tested him, but all were reminders that mortals did not walk or sail their paths alone. Athena, wise and watchful, looked upon him with care, guiding where she could, lending strength when his own seemed stretched. Poseidon, lord of the sea, bore a grievance against him, and so the waters that might have carried him swiftly home would often delay him, steering him elsewhere, as though the sea itself resisted his return. But even this, told here, can be felt not as wrath but as the ebb and flow of life, the way currents sometimes carry us where we did not intend to go, and yet still onward. The journey of Odysseus is filled with encounters that have become legend, but in this telling, we see them less as battles and more as landscapes, each one a resting place for the imagination. There were islands where strange beings dwelled, places where time seemed to move differently, moments where choices weighed heavy. Yet each of these may be seen as a chapter not of conflict, but of reflection, like stones placed carefully along a path. One of the first of these places was the land of the lotus. The ships, weary from travel, found a shore where flowers bloomed in abundance, their fragrance drifting on the breeze. The people who lived there offered food not of grain or meat, but of the lotus, a plant whose taste brought forgetfulness. For those who ate of it, the memory of home softened, and the longing for return faded like mist beneath the sun. The sailors who tasted the lotus sat in calm, smiling faintly, content to remain where they were. Odysseus, though, gently guided them back, reminding them of Ithaca, reminding them of their journey. One may imagine the scene not as struggle, but as quiet persuasion, a soft gathering of friends back to the ships, the sails rising once more, the horizon calling them forward. Beyond that land lay others, each with its own character. Some were lush with green, others rocky and bare. The sea stretched between them, vast and unbroken, yet never empty. Dolphins played alongside the ships, leaping gracefully, their bodies catching the light. Birds followed, their wings steady above the masts. At night, the stars returned, constant, patient, guiding. The sailors slept to the sound of waves lapping against wood, a sound as steady as breath, as comforting as a heartbeat. The journey was long, but it was never without beauty. Even when storms rose, with winds pulling at the sails and waves climbing high, there was still the vastness of the sea itself, alive and eternal. And when calm returned, it was like a blessing, a reminder that no storm lasts forever, that peace always follows. So, Odysseus' story begins, not in haste, not in violence, but in the slow unfolding of a journey, in the gentle rhythm of travel across water, in the quiet strength of a man whose heart held fast to home. The sea is never the same 2 days in a row. Some mornings it lies flat and gleaming, like polished stone reflecting the sky. Other mornings it ripples with small movements, as though invisible fingers were tracing patterns upon its surface. For the men aboard Odysseus' ships, each day brought a slightly different face of the ocean, but always its presence, its endless horizon, its patient reminder of the distance still between them and home. Among the islands they approached, after leaving the land of the lotus, was one inhabited by beings larger than men, beings who lived not in cities of stone but in caves carved from the living rock. These were the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants, and their island was as wild as their lives. Sheep grazed freely, wandering over hills without walls or shepherds, and the land seemed to carry no mark of plows, no touch of order. Odysseus and his men, curious and in need of supplies, stepped ashore. The air was still, and the grass beneath their feet was soft, scented faintly of herbs crushed under sandals. In time they came upon a vast cave, and within it, signs of life baskets, tools, and the sound of animals shifting. The cave belonged to Polyphemus, one of the and though the tale is often told with shouts and sudden violence, here we may picture it more quietly, as though events moved in slow motion, each detail lingering in the dim light of the cavern. The giant returned with the fading of day, guiding his flock into the safety of stone walls. His single eye was like a moon rising, round and luminous, casting its gaze upon the strangers. He spoke not gently, but in a deep, echoing voice that seemed to rumble through the cave itself. His presence was immense, his shadow filling the space, and for the men of Ithaca there was a moment of stillness, a recognition of the distance between mortal and giant, between human scale and something greater. What followed is remembered as cleverness, Odysseus' wit guiding them to escape the danger. Yet for our telling, we linger less on fear and more on the careful unfolding of thought. Odysseus, calm even when others trembled, formed his plan. He spoke with the giant, his words measured, his tone composed, as though weaving a net of sound around Polyphemus. And when the time came, when the giant slept heavily, his breath filling the cave with long, steady rhythms, Odysseus acted. The details of fire and blindness, of cries and confusion, soften here into a quieter vision, the cave opening, the sheep passing outward, the men clinging gently to wool and fleece as they moved back toward the freedom of the shore. The sea, waiting beyond, welcomed them once again, its waves cool against their hands as they pushed their ship from the sand. Sailing onward, the air cleared. The cries of the Cyclops grew distant, then faded altogether, replaced by the constant voice of the sea. For a time, silence held them. The men rowed steadily, their bodies moving in rhythm, the sound of wood against water repeating like a lullaby. Odysseus stood once more at the helm, watching the horizon, the thought of Ithaca still bright within him, though shadows of new trials lay ahead. Among those trials was an encounter with Aeolus, keeper of the winds. His island was unlike others, for it seemed set apart, rising from the water like a jewel, its cliffs white and gleaming, its slopes green with meadows where the air itself seemed to sing. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus kindly, offering rest, offering food, and at last, offering a gift, a bag in which the winds themselves had been tied. With this, Odysseus could guide his ships, calling upon breezes when needed, avoiding storms that might otherwise delay him. It was a gift of balance, a reminder that even the forces of the world could be held gently in human hands. Yet, as with many gifts, it required trust. Odysseus, weary from days upon the sea, placed his faith in his companions, letting the bag rest untied while he slept. And in that sleep, curiosity overcame them. Wondering what treasure their captain withheld, they loosened the cords, and the winds escaped in a rush. The calm sea awoke suddenly, not in anger but in wild movement, tossing the ships, driving them not homeward but backward, all the way once more to Aeolus' island. And here again, rather than hearing shouts and curses, we may hear only the sound of waves reshaping themselves. The sigh of Odysseus as he realized the journey must stretch further, the patience required to begin again. For in truth, the sea itself is never rushed. It knows no urgency, only the endless exchange of tides, the slow rhythm of days and nights. Odysseus, bound to the sea, learned its lessons again and again, to wait, to endure, to continue forward even when the path bent backward. As time moved onward, the ships reached new shores, some friendly, some hostile. They came to the land of the Lastrygonians, where cliffs rose high and the air was heavy with a stillness that seemed to hold secrets. These were giants too, though unlike the Cyclopes, their presence was less of solitude and more of force. Their hands reached swiftly, their strength overwhelming. Ships were crushed, companions lost, and the sea once again became both a refuge and a sorrow, carrying those who remained away from danger. Though the memory lingered like the echo of thunder long after the storm had passed, yet not all islands held terror. Some were places of enchantment, where the air shimmered as though filled with unseen music. Such was the island of Circe, the enchantress whose hall stood deep within a forest, surrounded by trees whose leaves glowed golden in the light. Circe, with her presence serene yet mysterious, welcomed Odysseus's men with food and drink. But the food was touched with magic, the drink filled with transformation, and those who partook were changed into creatures of the field, pigs that wandered where men had stood. Odysseus, steady and unyielding, sought to undo what had been done. Guided by counsel from Hermes, he entered Circe's hall, not as prey but as equal. There, instead of conflict, there grew understanding. For a year, Odysseus and his companions remained in her home, not in chains but in rest. The enchantress became less a captor and more a host, and her island a place of pause, a place where time itself seemed softened, its edges blurred. When at last they departed, Circe guided them further, telling of paths yet ahead, of challenges yet unseen. Among these was the passage past the sirens, whose voices called from rocky shores, whose songs promised knowledge and beauty, but whose embrace meant the end of voyages. Odysseus, ever curious, longed to hear their voices yet live, so he ordered his men to fill their ears with wax, and to bind him tightly to the mast. Imagine the ship as it passed that fateful stretch, the sea calm, the air filled with a music that shimmered, gentle yet irresistible. Odysseus, hearing it, leaned forward as far as his bonds allowed, eyes wide, not in terror but in wonder. The voices did not shout. They flowed like water, smooth and alluring. Yet the ropes held, the oars carried them onward, and soon the sound faded into distance, leaving only the hush of waves, the steady rhythm of oars, the peace of survival. So the journey continued, each island a new chapter, each encounter a new lesson, and through it all, Odysseus's heart held steady, like a compass pointing always toward Ithaca, toward Penelope, toward home. The sea, endless and calm after the voices of the sirens faded, seemed for a time like a gentle companion. Its swells lifted the ship lightly, the air smelled of salt and faint sweetness, and the men, weary though they were, found moments of quiet rest. Yet Odysseus knew there was another path before him, one not through storms or through battle, but through shadows. For Circe had spoken of it, a journey not across a land or sea of the living, but to the realm where shades reside, where voices echo softly from those who had gone before. And so, steering carefully, Odysseus and his men sailed onward until they came to that place where the living world meets the underworld. It was not marked by towering cliffs, nor by cities of stone. Instead, the shore was quiet, lined with trees that whispered faintly when the wind stirred their leaves. The ground felt cooler here, as though the sun itself softened its gaze. Odysseus walked forward with purpose. Though his heart was heavy, carrying offerings as Circe had instructed, he dug into the earth, pouring wine, milk, and honey, speaking words that drifted softly into the air, calling forth the spirits. The ground seemed to respond with silence, then with a gentle stirring, as though the veil between realms grew thinner. From that stillness, shapes began to appear. They were not solid as men are, nor entirely without form. Instead, they shimmered like reflections upon water, present and yet not wholly here. These were the shades of the dead, drawn by his voice, his offering, his call. Their eyes, faintly luminous, seemed filled with quiet knowledge, their presence carrying both calm and sorrow. Among them came figures of great weight and memory. The first to speak was Elpiner, a companion lost at Circe's hall, who had fallen unnoticed and unburied. His shade carried not anger but longing, a wish for rest, for remembrance, for the rites that connect the living to the departed. Odysseus listened, his voice low and steady, promising the honors that would bring peace. In that moment, the bond between men living and dead felt as strong as the seas pull upon the shore. Then, through the gathering of shades, came one whose presence was more solemn, more commanding. Tiresias the seer approached, his eyes closed yet filled with vision, his voice calm as flowing water. He spoke of what lay ahead, the dangers of the sea god's wrath, the temptation of the sun god's cattle, the long delay that still stretched between Odysseus and his return. The words were not harsh, not shouted, but steady and deliberate, like the tolling of a distant bell. Each prophecy unfolded like a tide, advancing with measured grace. And then came another present softer, filled with love and sorrow. Odysseus saw his mother, Anticlea, among the shades, and though the meeting was only of words, not of touch, it lingered in him with deep quietude. She told him of Ithaca, of Penelope's endurance, of Telemachus grown into youth. Her voice was gentle, a reminder that, though time stretches, though distances widen, bonds remain unbroken. Other shades appeared, to heroes of the past, kings of old, warriors of Troy who had gone before him. They spoke not with anger but with stories, their voices a chorus of memory. Achilles, who had chosen glory over long life, admitted with calm regret that even in the underworld, the quiet breath of life was sweeter. Agamemnon told of betrayal and sorrow. Ajax, still distant, turned away, silent as a shadow. Yet through all these meetings, Odysseus listened, not as one rushing, but as one absorbing, carrying their words like lanterns for the path ahead. At last, the shades receded, the air softened, the veil thickened once more. The land of the living returned in its stillness, with the sea awaiting his step. Odysseus, steady as ever, turned back to his men. They looked to him not with fear but with trust, knowing that, though the path stretched onward, their captain had walked where few mortals had walked, and had returned with knowledge, with warning, and with renewed resolve. The ship once more pushed off from the shore, the oars dipping into dark water, the horizon stretching forward. The underworld remained behind, yet its quiet voices stayed within Odysseus, like distant music carried upon the wind. The sea was calm again, but it was a different Comdeper, richer, as though the waters themselves had listened to, and now carried the weight of what had been spoken in that land of shadows. The men rowed softly, their breaths even, and the stars above wheeled slowly in silence, each one a reminder of the vastness of the journey still ahead. The ship drifted onward, the men quiet, their thoughts still carrying the echoes of the underworld. The sea before them stretched vast and open, its surface smooth as polished stone beneath the starlight. Odysseus, seated at the stern, watched the constellations wheel slowly above. They were guides as steady as memory itself, showing the way as the vessel moved steadily forward, always forward, toward yet more trials whispered long ago by Circe and confirmed by the voice of Tiresias. There came a day when Circe's counsel returned to mind. She had spoken of two paths, both narrow and filled with peril. On one side, a monstrous cliff, and within its hollow, Scylla, a creature with many heads, sharp of teeth and swift of strike. On the other, a whirlpool, Charybdis, whose breath pulled the sea into its throat and sent it crashing back in a surge of ruin. Neither path offered ease, yet through one there was hope of survival, if only they kept their courage and rowed with steady arms. The sea grew darker as they neared those straits. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, and the ship glided slowly, the oars dipping like whispers. Odysseus stood watch, his gaze fixed, his heart calm though he knew the danger. He remembered Circe's advice to steer close to Scylla, for though some loss would come, the whirlpool promised none could escape. And so, guiding the tiller with steady hand, he drew the ship nearer to the cliffs, their shadows falling long across the water. The men rowed, their faces calm though their eyes searched the rock. Then, from the hollow above, movement stirred. Scylla's heads darted swift as arrows, reaching down with sudden force. Yet even this moment, sharp though it might seem in another telling, softened here into something distant, something already fading. For the ship continued on, carried by the strength of the rowers, the pull of the sea, and the quiet will of Odysseus. Behind them, the cliffs grew smaller, the danger passed, and the calm of the waters slowly returned. They sailed onward, and the memory of Circe's words returned again, the cattle of the sun. She had warned them not to harm what belonged to the god Helios, for his herds was sacred, his eye unblinking, his anger enduring. Yet hunger weighs heavily upon weary men, and the journey was long. Days passed as the ship drifted under calm skies, until at last they came to a broad island, its shores soft with grass, its fields wide and golden. From afar, the lowing of cattle could be heard, steady as the sound of waves. Odysseus urged restraint, reminding his companions of the warnings, of the fate foretold, should they break this law. The men listened, nodding, but within them the weariness of hunger grew. At first they endured, living on what the sea and the land freely gave. But as the days stretched on and storms held them fast upon the shore, their resolve began to waver. But one quiet night, while Odysseus had withdrawn in prayer, they gathered among themselves, their voices low, their eyes drawn toward the herds that grazed calmly beneath the stars. And though they knew the weight of their choice, hunger guided their hands. By morning, the smoke of sacrifice rose softly into the air, carrying with it the scent of roasted flesh. The men, content in the moment, filled themselves, while Odysseus, returning, felt a heaviness upon his spirit. The god Helios saw, as he always did, and his voice carried to the ears of the high Olympians, demanding that justice be done. Yet the skies remained calm for a time, and the sea as gentle as ever, as though holding its breath. It was only when the ship once more set sail that the wrath descended. The horizon darkened, winds stirred, first soft, then growing with each breath, until the sea heaved high and the mast cracked like a reed in the gale. The men cried out, yet their voices were carried away by the storm. The ship splintered, boards torn loose, oars swept into the waves. One by one, the companions were carried beneath the waters, their cries fading into silence, leaving only Odysseus upon the sea. And yet even in this, the story softens. For though loss had come, though the waves seemed endless, Odysseus clung to the timbers of the wreck, borne by the currents not into despair, but onward, always onward, toward yet another shore. The storm passed, the sea quieted, and the sunlight, golden and calm, returned to the waters. Alone, Odysseus drifted, his heart steady, his spirit enduring. The world seemed vast and empty, yet in that emptiness was peace. The sound of the waves like a lullaby, the touch of the sea like a cradle. Time stretched, days passed, and at last the current carried him to the island of Ogygia, where new chapters awaited, and the long journey still unfolded. The sea, after the storm and the loss of his companions, carried Odysseus gently, as though the waves themselves pitied the lone traveler. Upon the broken timbers he drifted, the sun soft upon his skin, the stars bright each night above. At last, after days that passed like dreams, the current bore him to a hidden island, quiet and green. embraced by calm waters, that this was Ogygia, the home of the nymph Calypso. The island lay wrapped in beauty forests, heavy with fragrant cedar and cypress, springs of clear water singing as they flowed through meadows bright with flowers. Birds moved gently through the branches, and vines curled in patterns across the rocks. It was a place untouched by hardship, a still corner of the world where time seemed to pause. Calypso found him upon the shore, weary yet unbroken. She brought him into her dwelling, a grotto where firelight flickered softly against smooth stone, and the air carried the scent of blossoms. She tended his wounds, gave him food and drink, and offered him rest. And there Odysseus remained, not for days or months, but for years that slipped past like water, uncounted and still. Calypso loved him, and in her voice was kindness, in her care was devotion. She spoke of eternity, offering him immortality, the chance to remain forever on her island, free from toil, free from aging, free from loss. Her eyes shone with hope as she spoke of life together, unbroken by time. Yet Odysseus, though grateful, felt the pull of Ithaca within him. In quiet moments, seated upon the shore, he would gaze across the endless horizon. His heart carried the memory of Penelope, steadfast in her weaving, of Telemachus, grown yet unseen, of the hearth and home that waited, though long delayed. His longing was gentle, yet unshaken, like the steady tide, and so the days passed peaceful, unhurried, yet filled with a yearning that Calypso could not soften. The gods, watching from Olympus, saw this as well. Athena, who had guided him from the first, spoke again to the others, her voice steady in its plea. She told of his endurance, of his trials, of his faithfulness to home, asking once more that his journey be allowed to end. Zeus, father of gods and men, listened, and with calm decree he sent Hermes, the messenger swift of wing, to Ogygia. The god descended, his presence bright against the green of the island. Calypso welcomed him with courtesy, though her heart sensed what message he bore. Hermes spoke plainly, though his words were gentle. Odysseus must go, for it was not his fate to remain here, but to return to Ithaca, to the life awaiting him. Calypso listened, her eyes shadowed with sorrow, for though her love was true, she could not stand against the will of Zeus, and so she turned to Odysseus. She did not bind him nor curse him, but instead, with a voice softened by grief, she gave him freedom. She told him of the raft he must build, gave him tools, and showed him where tall trees might be cut. Together they worked, though silence often filled the air, for parting had already begun to weigh upon them. When the raft was finished, sturdy and bound with ropes, Calypso brought food and skins of fresh water. She walked with him to the shore, her steps slow, her gaze lingering. She spoke blessings upon his journey, though her voice trembled with loss. And Odysseus, standing beside her, gave thanks not only for her care but for her kindness in release. The sea stretched wide and open before him. The raft, simple yet strong, floated gently at the water's edge. With steady breath, Odysseus stepped aboard, took up the sail, and felt the wind carry him forward. Calypso remained upon the shore, her figure growing smaller as distance widened, until at last the island of Ogygia was only a memory upon the horizon. And so once more Odysseus was upon the open sea, the sun warm above, the stars wheeling each night, his course set by the constellations. His heart was filled with longing, yet also with renewed strength, for now he moved nearer to the life he sought, nearer to Ithaca, though trials yet remained. The sea carried Odysseus onward, steady and bright beneath clear skies. Days passed in quiet rhythm, the creak of ropes, the whisper of wind in the sail, the gentle rise and fall of the waves. Each night, stars shone their eternal patterns, guiding his hand upon the tiller, while the moon cast silver across the waters. But Poseidon, god of the sea, had not forgotten the anger that burned within him, for Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and though much time had passed, the wound remained in the heart of the sea god. And so, as Odysseus drifted upon his fragile raft, Poseidon stirred the waters once more. The sky grew dark, winds rising from every quarter, waves leaped high, crashing upon the raft, tearing at its ropes, bending its mast. The timbers groaned, the sail split, and the sea, vast and merciless, swallowed the little craft. Odysseus clung to what remained, tossed among the waves, the salt stinging his eyes, the roar filling his ears. Yet even here, the story softens, for though the storm was fierce, fate was not yet finished with him. Leucathea, a sea goddess, gentle and watchful, rose from the foam and took pity. She offered him her veil, a gift of safety, telling him to cast aside the wreckage and trust the sea to bear him. Odysseus, though weary, listened. Wrapping the veil about himself, he let go of the broken timbers and swam, his strokes steady, his breath calm though the waves still heaved. For 2 days he drifted, borne by the currents, until at last the storm passed and the shore of another land came into view. It was the island of Scheria, home to the Phaeacians, a people blessed with ships, swift as thought and hearts inclined to hospitality. Odysseus, exhausted, crawled upon the shore and found rest beneath a grove of olive trees, his body wrapped in leaves, the earth soft beneath him. There he slept, the sea's roar fading into dreams. At dawn, the princess Nausicaa came to that shore, her maidens laughing as they washed garments in the stream. Their voices, bright and gentle, woke Odysseus from his slumber. Rising with care, he spoke not with pride but with humility, asking only for aid. Nausicaa, touched by his words and his presence, gave him clothing, food, and guidance. Her heart open in kindness, led to the palace of her father, King Alcinous. Odysseus was welcomed as a guest. The halls of the Phaeacians were bright with polished bronze and golden vessels, their gardens heavy with fruit, their ships swift and strong. Alcinous, with Queen Arete at his side, listened to the wanderer's tale, his voice calm, his eyes attentive. There, for the first time in many years, Odysseus told the full story of his journey, of Troy, of the Chacones, of the Lotusi, of the Cyclops, of Aeolus, of Circe, of the Sirens, of Scylla and Charybdis, of the cattle of the sun, of Calypso's island. His voice was steady, his words unfolding like the sea itself, wave upon wave, until all was spoken. The Phaeacians, moved by his trials, promised to carry him home. Their ships, guided by thought alone, cut through the waters swift as dreams. And so Odysseus, at last, was borne not by storm nor by struggle, but by the kindness of others, sleeping as the vessel glided over calm seas. Ithaca drawing near upon the horizon, the ship of the Phaeacians glided across the waters like a dream made real. Its prow cut the sea without effort, as though guided not by hands nor oars, but by thought itself. The sailors moved silently, their eyes steady, their minds fixed on their task. For this voyage was not one of trade or conquest, but of compassion. The night stretched above them, clear and infinite, filled with stars that turned slowly in their courses. The moon poured a pale silver light across the surface of the sea, and in that light Odysseus slept. He lay upon soft rugs, the hum of the waves rocking him gently. His body finally eased after years of toil. His breath rose and fell in calm rhythm, his face at peace. The dreams that came to him were not of storms nor monsters, not of hardship nor fear, but of home. He saw the shores of Ithaca as though he were already there, the jagged cliffs, the olive groves, the smell of earth warmed by the sun. He saw Penelope at her loom, her fingers moving steadily, her eyes patient. He saw Telemachus grown tall, yet still carrying the quiet innocence of youth. He saw the hearth where once he had sat, the fields where once he had walked. In his dream, all was still, all was waiting. The ship moved on, swift and sure, until at last the coastline of Ithaca rose upon the horizon. The sailors, with practiced hands, brought the vessel to a sheltered harbor. The dawn was only just beginning to brush the sky with pale colors, soft pinks and golds, the faintest touch of light before full day. Mist lingered over the hills, and the land lay quiet, as though holding its breath for the moment of return. The Phaeacians, careful not to disturb him, lifted Odysseus gently from where he lay. They carried him to the shore, setting him upon the soft sand beneath the shade of olive trees. They placed beside him the gifts they had promised, chests of clothing, of gold, of fine woven cloth, treasures fit for a king. Then, quietly, they returned to their ship, their task complete. Without sound, the vessel slipped once more into the open waters. Leaving Odysseus alone upon the land of his birth, he stirred slowly, the sand cool beneath his hands, the scent of earth and salt mingling in the air. When his eyes opened, he saw the familiar line of cliffs, the dark green of olives, the curve of the harbor. For a moment he did not speak nor rise, for the sight before him was almost too much to bear. This was Ithaca. After so many years, after so many storms, he had returned. Yet Odysseus was not one to rush. His heart longed to rise and walk openly upon the land, to call out to those who had waited, to embrace what was his. But wisdom, his constant companion, held him still. for he knew the suitors still filled his halls, men who had wasted his flocks, courted his wife, and plotted against his son. To reveal himself openly would be folly. It was then that Athena appeared, her presence quiet yet radiant, her eyes bright with purpose. She had guided him before, and now once more she stood beside him. She spoke gently, her voice steady as the breeze. She told him of the suitors, of their arrogance, of their plans. She reminded him of the patience he had always carried, and of the need for cunning now more than ever. With a touch of her hand, she changed his form. His hair grew thin and grey, his shoulders bent, his skin roughened and weathered, his bright eyes dulled, his clothing turned to rags. Where once stood a king, now there seemed only a beggar, weary and worn by life. In this disguise, Odysseus would walk unseen, free to learn what awaited him in his halls. He rose, his body feeling strange beneath the disguise, yet his mind steady. Step by step he moved across the shore, his feet pressing into the sand of home. Each sound was familiar, the whisper of leaves, the call of birds, the rhythm of waves against rock. Each sight was known, the shape of the hills, the winding paths, the groves of olive and fig. Every breath of air carried with it memories, and though he bore the form of a beggar, within he was still Odysseus, king of Ithaca. His first meeting was with a shepherd, a young man tending flocks upon the hillside. The shepherd greeted him kindly, offering food and drink, asking no questions of his appearance. Odysseus spoke with care, weaving words that concealed his identity, yet allowed him to learn of what had passed. From the shepherd he heard of the suitor's wastefulness, of Penelope's steadfastness, of Telemachus' courage. Each word strengthened his resolve, for though he had been absent, his household had not fallen entirely into ruin. There was still loyalty, still hope. Guided by Athena, he then sought out the hut of Eumaeus, the faithful and humble. Eumaeus had long tended the pigs of Odysseus, guarding them even as others betrayed their duties. His hut was simple, built of stone and wood, smoke curling gently from its roof. When Odysseus arrived in his beggar's guise, Eumaeus welcomed him without hesitation, offering bread and wine, a place by the fire, and words of kindness. As Odysseus sat within the hut, listening to the crackle of flames, he felt the warmth, not only of the hearth, but of loyalty long preserved. Eumaeus spoke of his master, believing him lost, yet never failing in his care for the household that remained. He spoke of Penelope, who wove each day and unraveled each night, keeping hope alive through craft and patience. He spoke of Telemachus, who had set forth upon the sea to seek news of his father. Each word was steady, each word a thread in the fabric of faithfulness. Odysseus, though disguised, felt a deep swell of gratitude. He spoke in return with calm wisdom, sharing stories shaped not of truth but of meaning, stories that comforted and strengthened. In his words, Eumaeus heard the echo of the values he himself held: endurance, loyalty, patience. The two men, though seeming strangers, sat together in harmony, the fire warming them as night fell outside. For days Odysseus remained with Eumaeus, listening, learning, preparing. The time to reveal himself had not yet come, but the time drew nearer. Each morning he looked upon the land of Ithaca with quiet eyes, taking in again what he had once known. Each night he slept upon the earth of his home, the ground beneath him firm, the stars above him eternal dot. At last Athena spoke to him once more, telling him that Telemachus would soon return from his journey. The moment of reunion was near, and with it the weaving of plans that would restore his house. Odysseus breathed deeply, his heart calm yet steady with anticipation. For though the road had been long and filled with hardship, each step now brought him closer to the hearth, closer to the embrace of his son, closer to the moment when patience would give way to action. And so, in the quiet hut of the swineherd, Odysseus waited. The days passed softly, filled with the sounds of the animals, the murmur of voices, the crackle of fire. The island of Ithaca surrounded him, familiar and beloved, every stone and tree whispering his name. Though he wore the form of a beggar, though none yet knew him, he was home, and home, at last, would be where his story turned toward its end. The days in the swineherd's hut passed slowly, each one marked by the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Smoke rose softly from the hearth each morning, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and warm bread. The pigs moved restlessly in their pens, their sounds blending with the faint cries of birds in the olive groves. Beyond the hut, the island of Ithaca stretched quiet and calm, its hills still veiled in early autumn mist, its pathways winding toward the sea. Eumaeus, faithful and unshaken, tended his flocks with the same devotion he had carried for years. He rose with the first light of dawn, his hands rough with labor, his eyes tired yet filled with quiet steadiness. He spoke little of himself, for his thoughts were always of his absent master, of Penelope in her vigil, of Telemachus braving the seas in search of word. Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, watched him with careful eyes, his heart moved by the man's loyalty. Each word of kindness Eumaeus offered, each simple act of care, was a reminder that not all had forgotten. As Odysseus listened to the swineherd, he felt the great weight of years upon his shoulders. 10 years of war, 10 more of wandering, the endless journey that had tested his strength, his mind, his will. Yet here, in this humble place, he found the thread that had held his will together. Not palaces nor wealth, but loyalty. The loyalty of a servant who asked nothing in return, who gave without thought of reward. It was during these days of waiting that the sea brought Telemachus home. He had sailed across dangerous waters, had spoken with kings and old companions of his father, and had carried in his heart the uncertainty of youth. His journey had taught him much about men, about hardship, about the weight of his lineage. Now, guided by Athena's quiet hand, he returned to Ithaca, his ship landing in secret to avoid the watchful eyes of the suitors. Athena, ever watchful, came first to Telemachus in disguise. She spoke to him of caution, of the dangers that lingered in his halls. She told him of the suitors' plans, of their traps laid along the road, and she guided him not to the palace but to the hut of Eumaeus, where his father waited in beggar's form. The goddess's words fell like gentle rain upon dry earth, steadying his spirit, strengthening his resolve. Telemachus walked the paths of Ithaca with quiet steps, his eyes scanning the familiar hills and trees. He was taller now, his shoulders stronger, yet his heart still carried the longing for a father he had never truly known. Each stone of the land whispered to him, each breeze seemed to carry memory. His steps grew quicker as he neared the hut, though he knew not what awaited him there. Inside, Odysseus sat near the hearth, his beggar's guise intact, his eyes lowered though his mind was sharp and alert. When the door opened and Telemachus stepped inside, a silence filled the room, deep and resonant. Like the pause before a great tide, Eumaeus rose with joy, his heart full at the sight of the young man. He embraced Telemachus, weeping softly as a father might, though not of blood but of devotion. His words poured out praise for the youth's safe return, warnings of the dangers within the halls, prayers of gratitude. Telemachus, touched by his loyalty, returned his kindness with warmth, thanking him for his steadfast care. And all the while, Odysseus watched. His heart surged at the sight of his son, grown tall, strong of bearing, his features carrying echoes of his own youth. Yet he remained still, silent, hidden beneath the mask of age and poverty. He listened to the voice of his son, a voice he had never heard in childhood, for he had left when the boy was but an infant. Now here he was, no longer a child, but a man. Eumaeus, ever generous, introduced the beggar to Telemachus. He spoke of this wanderer who had come to his hut, who carried stories of distant lands. Telemachus greeted him politely, offering words of kindness, though his heart was heavy with his own thoughts. He did not see his father before him, only a weary stranger. As the day wore on, Eumaeus departed briefly to tend to his flocks, leaving father and son alone within the hut. The fire crackled softly, the smoke curling upward, the shadows shifting gently across the walls. Odysseus, guided by Athena's unseen hand, turned to his son. His voice was low, steady, and filled with care. He spoke words that hinted at truth, words that carried weight. Telemachus listened, puzzled, his brow furrowed, as though the beggar's words stirred something deep within him. At last, Athena herself appeared within the hut, her form radiant, her presence undeniable. With a gesture, she touched Odysseus, and the disguise melted away. The grey hair darkened, the bent shoulders straightened, the worn skin smoothed. Before Telemachus now stood not a beggar but a man of strength, his eyes bright with the fire of life, his presence commanding yet gentle. For a moment, Telemachus stared, disbelief holding him still. Then Odysseus spoke, his voice firm yet tender, naming himself as father. Tears rose unbidden to the eyes of the young man. He reached out, uncertain at first, but as Odysseus embraced him, the doubt melted away. Father and son held each other, the years of absence collapsing in a single moment of reunion. Words came slowly, halting at first, then flowing like a river long dammed. They spoke of loss, of endurance, of hope that had never died. Telemachus wept openly, Odysseus with quiet strength, their bond sealed not only by blood, but by the trials that had brought them to this point. When the first rush of reunion had passed, Odysseus spoke with calm resolve. He told his son of the suitors, of their arrogance, of their waste. He spoke of the need for patience, of the careful weaving of plans. Telemachus listened, his young heart burning with anger, but tempered by his father's wisdom. Together they began to form their course, how they would move unseen, how they would measure the suitors' strength, how they would strike when the moment was right. The fire burned low as their voices wove through the night. Outside, the stars shone silently, as though bearing witness to the reunion. Within the hut, the air was filled, not with fear but with purpose. 2 generations, long separated, now stood united. The weight of the years was heavy, but heavier still was the bond they now shared. Eumaeus returned, finding them once more in beggar's guise, for secrecy was their shield. The plan had only just begun, and caution was still their greatest ally. Yet beneath the disguise, the truth had been spoken. The bond restored. And so the night deepened, the hut standing small upon the hillside. Yet within it, the fate of Ithaca was being shaped. Father and son sat together, their hearts steady, their minds clear. For though the road ahead would demand courage, patience, and strength, they no longer walked it alone. The morning came softly, its light spreading over the hills of Ithaca with a golden hush. The swineherd's hut lay still in the first quiet hours, its walls touched with the pale glow of dawn. Smoke rose faintly from the hearth, as Eumaeus prepared for the day's tasks. Odysseus, once more cloaked in the weary form of a beggar, sat quietly near the fire, his eyes lowered, though within them burned a patient flame. Beside him, Telemachus stood tall, the memory of their secret reunion still fresh, his heart steady yet filled with anticipation. The time had come for Odysseus to walk once more into the heart of his home. Not as king, not yet, but as a stranger. The halls that had once echoed with his voice now resounded with the laughter of others. The feast tables once laid for honored guests now bore the weight of greedy suitors. Yet he would not stride in with anger. He would walk slowly, humbly, hidden beneath rags, his spirit cloaked as carefully as his form. For patience was his shield, and wisdom his weapon. Eumaeus, faithful as ever, guided the disguised Odysseus toward the palace. The road was lined with memories, olive trees planted in younger days, stones that bore the prints of countless journeys, paths that had once carried Odysseus to battle, to council, to festival. Each step was a return, yet each step was also a test, for he must walk unseen, unnoticed, as though he were a stranger upon his own soil. As they approached the city, voices rose upon the earth, the market's hum, the laughter of youths, the calls of merchants. The world of Ithaca bustled as it always had, yet beneath the ordinary rhythm lay a tension, a waiting, as though the land itself knew change was near. The beggar's staff tapped gently against the ground, a quiet counter to the noise, a reminder of the disguise that shielded him. At last they reached the palace. Its great doors stood wide, the marble worn yet dignified, the columns rising tall against the sky. The sound of feasting drifted outward, the clatter of cups, the strum of lyres, the careless laughter of men who believed themselves secure. Odysseus paused a moment, his eyes lingering on the threshold. This was his home, his hall, his hearth. Yet he entered as a wanderer, unknown, unrecognized. With a breath as steady as the sea, he stepped within. The suitors sat in careless splendor, their cloaks spread wide, their hands heavy with rings. Platters of food lay half-eaten before them, goblets brimming with wine. They reclined as though the palace were theirs, their voices loud, their eyes sharp with arrogance. Among them moved servants, weary with endless labor, their faces resigned to the waste they were forced to witness. None turned with respect at the beggar's entrance. Some looked with scorn, others with laughter, their words sharp as stones, tossed idly at a stray dog. Yet Odysseus bowed his head, speaking no reply. Athena had cloaked him well, and none saw the fire beneath the disguise. He moved quietly among them, leaning upon his staff, his steps slow and measured. To the eyes of the suitors, he was nothing more than a beggar, a man broken by years, seeking scraps. Yet behind the lowered gaze, every detail was noted, the measure of each man, the arrogance in his speech, the strength of his arm, the sway of his temper. Odysseus gathered all, storing it like arrows in a quiver. As he entered, the suitors mocked him. Some threw bones from the tables, Others taunted with cruel words. Their laughter rose, but Odysseus bore it calmly, as a rock bears the beating waves. He had endured storms far greater than this. He had faced the wrath of gods, the lure of sirens, the depths of the sea. The barbs of arrogant men could not shake him. Amid the noise, Penelope's presence remained like a still flame. She sat apart, her weaving near, her thoughts hidden deep within her heart. Her eyes turned often toward the strangers who entered her hall, for she had learned long ago that answers sometimes arrived in the humblest forms. She did not yet know that her gaze lingered on her husband, hidden beneath rags. Yet something in her heart stirred a quiet sense that change was near, that the threads of waiting were drawing to their end. Odysseus, still cloaked, sat near the threshold, receiving little but scraps. Yet in that quiet place he found his vantage. He watched Telemachus move among the suitors, his son standing taller now, his voice firmer, though still met with scorn by those who believed themselves masters. The boy bore their insults with patience, guided by his father's counsel, careful not to reveal the strength of their bond. Together, though unseen, father and son moved like twin currents beneath the surface of a restless sea. Evening fell, and the suitors called for more feasting, more music, more waste. The lyres played, the voices rose, and the shadows of the great hall grew long upon the walls. Amid the clamor, Odysseus remained patient, for he knew the time was not yet ripe. To strike in haste would be to lose all. To endure in silence was to gain the knowledge that would ensure victory. Later, when the feast quieted and the suitors withdrew to their sleep, Penelope approached the beggar. Her steps were light, her presence gentle, yet her spirit strong. She questioned him softly, asking of his origin, his wanderings, the lands he had seen. Odysseus, careful in his answers, spoke in riddled truths, of a man long absent, of loyalty unbroken, of hope that flickered even in darkness. His words touched her heart, for though she could not yet see, she felt a thread of truth in them. Her eyes grew wet, though she turned them aside, for her sorrow was private. Still, the beggar's voice comforted her, as though he carried some unseen assurance. The night deepened, and Odysseus rested upon the cold floor of his own hall. The stones hard beneath him, the shadows close around him. Yet within his heart there was no despair. He had entered the place where he had been absent so long. He had seen his son grown, had spoken to his wife, had measured the men who consumed his wealth. The path ahead was clear, though the steps must be measured with care. And so Block 9 draws to a close in quiet tension. The beggar sits in his hall, unseen for who he is, enduring insult, carrying patience as his armor. Around him, the house hums with false laughter and waste. Yet above all, the steady pulse of his return beats on. Soon the suitors will face their reckoning. Soon Penelope's waiting will end. Soon Ithaca will know its king once more. The tale continues, as the journey of Odysseus drifts gently into yet another chapter, one filled with layers of memory, longing, and the enduring pull of home. After leaving behind the trials with Sid, the man of many turns finds himself again upon the open sea, where the sky stretches endlessly, and the waters reflect shifting moods that mirror his own weary heart. The winds carry him forward, sometimes soft as a whisper, sometimes heavy as if they bore the weight of destiny itself. And all the while his thoughts circle back to Ithaca, to Penelope, to the son who had grown in his absence. The course ahead, however, was not yet free of struggle. Guided by Circe's wisdom, Odysseus understood that he must face perils few mortals ever dared to glimpse. The first of these was the passage past the sirens, whose voices were said to lure sailors into ruin. Their song, sweet and irresistible, promised knowledge, joy, and eternal wonder. But beneath it lay only silence and death among the rocks where ships splintered and disappeared into foam. Circe had warned him of this fate, and Odysseus, thoughtful and cautious, devised a way to endure. He ordered his men to fill their ears with wax, sealing out the seductive music. Yet for himself, he chose another path. He longed to hear the song, not to surrender, but to understand its power. Bound tightly to the mast, unable to free himself, he sailed into the sirens' reach, and when their voices rose, it was as if the air itself shimmered. They sang not only of joy but of secrets hidden deep within the world, of truths buried in time, of wisdom older than the waves. His heart strained, his body pulled against the ropes, desperate to reach them. Yet his crew rowed on, deaf to the call, their strokes steady and relentless. The ship passed beyond the danger, and the voices faded into silence. leaving only the sound of the oars and the steady beat of Odysseus's heart. The trial was endured, and yet the memory of that haunting song lingered, like a dream that refuses to dissolve with waking dot. Beyond the sirens lay yet another choice, one no sailor could avoid without sacrifice. On one side of the narrow strait loomed Scylla, the many-headed monster whose gaping maws could seize men from their ships in an instant. On the other side churned Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed the sea-hole and dragged everything into its depths. Circe had told him that no path would be without loss, that survival demanded choosing the lesser of two evils. With a heavy heart, Odysseus steered toward Scylla, knowing the beast would claim some of his men, but that to drift too close to Charybdis meant the end of them all. The moment came swift and merciless. As they rowed past, Scylla struck, her heads darting from the shadows of the cliff. Screams rose, cut short, as 6 of his finest companions were lifted into the air, their cries fading into the roar of the sea. Odysseus could do nothing but endure, his hands clenched on the tiller, his heart torn by helpless grief. It was the price of passage, the cost demanded by the narrow way between doom and survival. The ship pressed on, lighter now in spirit as well as in number, and silence fell heavy upon the crew. And still, their trials were not complete. They came at last to the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. Circe, and even the spirit of the prophet Tiresias, had warned Odysseus to shun that place, to touch not the herds, for destruction would follow. Yet the sea does not always yield to human will, and storms drove them ashore. For a time, they endured, feeding only on what little the land and sea could offer. But hunger grew, gnawing at the hearts of men as steadily as the waves gnawed at the shore. Odysseus had sworn them to restraint, had pleaded with them to resist temptation. But while he prayed alone, seeking strength from the gods, his men's resolve faltered. They slew the cattle, feasted upon the forbidden flesh, and sealed their fate. When the storm at last relented and they put to sea, Zeus himself struck down in wrath, calling forth thunder and lightning. The ship splintered beneath the assault, the waves swallowed all, and Odysseus alone was carried upon broken timbers, drifting across the endless waters, the last survivor of his crew. It was then that he was borne to Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso, whose love held him captive for long years, far from his homeland. But that, too, belongs to the next passage of his tale. By the time Odysseus at last approached the end of his wanderings, the years had carved deeply into his spirit. He had crossed seas that seemed without end, passed through lands of wonder and terror, and endured storms sent by both gods and chance. Yet the thread of fate, long and winding, had not broken. Slowly, gently, like the tide that creeps over a shore, it drew him closer to Ithaca, the land of his birth, the home of his heart. Athena, ever his guardian, watched over him now with greater care. Though she had guided him at many turns, her presence in these final stages was more intimate, more tender, as though she too wished the wanderer's suffering to finally meet its rest. Disguised in quiet forms, she walked unseen at his side, whispering courage into his heart, reminding him that even the longest night yields to dawn at last. His raft, battered by storms and salvaged by hope, was borne upon calm waters to the shores of the Phaeacians, a people touched by the gods, skilled in seafaring, and blessed with hearts that knew generosity. Here, weary and near despair, Odysseus found unexpected sanctuary. Nausicaa, the young daughter of the king, discovered him where he lay among reeds and tide pools, and with gentle words she guided him toward safety. Her kindness was simple, untainted by guile, and her presence was like a clear spring flowing across parched earth. Welcomed into the halls of King Alcinous, Odysseus found hospitality that soothed his weariness. The Phaeacians, devoted to the sacred laws of guest and host, bathed him, clothed him, and set before him a feast. Music filled the hall, soft as twilight, and dancers moved in patterns that seemed to echo the rhythm of the sea itself. For the first time in many long years, Odysseus felt the warmth of human fellowship without fear, without treachery, without the shadow of loss pressing close upon him. Yet, when the bard began to sing, the song chosen was of Troy, of the wooden horse, of the fall of mighty walls, of the cunning of Odysseus himself. The notes rose softly through the air, winding like smoke, and with them came memories too heavy to bear. Tears slipped down Odysseus's face as he bowed his head, unable to hide the grief that the music had awakened. The king, seeing this, gently asked his guest's name, and so at last Odysseus revealed himself, not as a wanderer, not as a stranger, but as the king of Ithaca, long lost, long forgotten, yet still alive. The Phaeacians, moved by his story, resolved to aid him. They offered him passage home upon one of their swiftest ships, guided by sailors who knew the secrets of the sea. Before he left, he told them the long tale of his wanderings, recounting with steady voice all the wonders and sorrows he had endured: the cave of the Cyclops, the enchantments of Circe, the song of the sirens, the whirlpool of Charybdis, the island of Calypso, and the endless storms of Poseidon. The telling was like an unburdening, a river spilling forth its weight, leaving him lighter for having shared it at last. When the time came, Odysseus boarded the ship of the Phaeacians. The crew rowed in silence, the sea calm beneath them, the night soft above. He lay upon the deck, wrapped in a cloak, listening to the rhythm of the oars and the sigh of the waves. At last, for the first time in so many years, true sleep took him, deep and unbroken. No dreams troubled him, no fears intruded, only rest, pure and whole. And so it was that, as he slept, the ship carried him to Ithaca. The sailors, true to their promise, laid him gently upon the shore, placing beside him the gifts of their people, garments, treasures, tokens of goodwill. Then they departed quietly, leaving him to awaken in his homeland once more. The land was as he remembered it, and yet altered by time. The hills rising softly against the dawn, the olive groves whispering in the morning breeze, the scent of earth and salt and green carried upon the air. Ithaca had waited for him, patient as stone, steadfast as the sea, though its people, unknowing, had long begun to despair of their absent king. Odysseus, standing at last upon his own soil, bent low and kissed the ground. Tears filled his eyes, not of sorrow now, but of release, of the long-delayed reunion between wanderer and home. Yet the journey was not yet fully complete, for though he had returned, the task of reclaiming his place, his house, his family, still lay before him. The gods, watching, prepared the final threads of his fate, and Athena, faithful and wise, drew near once more, ready to guide him through the last trials of his long Odyssey. Odysseus awoke upon the familiar soil of Ithaca, the land that had haunted his dreams through endless nights, the land whose contours he could almost trace with his soul, even in the dark. Yet when he opened his eyes, it was not with a rush of triumph, but with a quiet disbelief, the kind that comes when a long-desired moment finally arrives after so much delay. He lay still for a time, listening to the gentle lap of waves upon the shore, the rustle of reeds in the breeze, the distant cry of seabirds. These sounds were old companions, unchanged by years, and their constancy was like balm upon his weary heart. Still, the path ahead was not without shadows. His home stood, but it was no longer whole, for within it waited suitorsmen who had long pressed upon his wife, Penelope, eager to claim his throne, his wealth, and her hand. They feasted at his tables, drank his wine, and filled the halls with noise. Yet Penelope had not yielded, faithful and steady, weaving by day and unweaving by night, holding despair at bay with her cleverness and her patience. For her, too, the years had been long, and her strength had been tested as deeply as Odysseus's own. Athena, who had guided Odysseus across the seas, now came to him once more, veiled in disguise but unmistakable in her wisdom. She counseled him to move with caution, to cloak his identity until the time was right. The hero, so often bold, now became a wanderer in his own land, disguised as a beggar, hidden beneath rags and dust. He moved through his home like a shadow, testing the hearts of those around him. Some welcomed him with kindness despite his seeming poverty, while others mocked and scorned him, blind to the truth of who he was. In these quiet wanderings, the tale slowed, softened. Odysseus, who had braved storms and gods, now braved silence and secrecy. He met his son Telemachus, who had grown from a boy into a man in his absence, a young soul shaped by longing and uncertainty. The moment of recognition between father and son came gently, with tears unspoken yet understood, as though a flame long hidden had been kindled anew. Their bond, fractured by years of absence, was reforged in a single breath. Together, with Athena's guidance, they prepared for the final step. Yet even this last trial was not told in tones of battle, for in the quiet rhythm of sleep, the clash of arms is softened into the ebb and flow of destiny. The bow of Odysseus, strung by none but him, became not a weapon of war, but a symbol, a test of identity and truth. As he lifted it, the years of wandering seemed to gather into his hands. The strength of memory, of loyalty, of endurance shaping the moment. The suitors, who had long consumed the bounty of his home, were at last revealed for what they were, intruders upon a sacred bond. The details of their fate, harsh in other tellings, now fade into shadow, for the heart of the story lies not in vengeance but in restoration. What mattered was that order returned, that the balance long disrupted was made whole again, that the hearth of Ithaca once more belonged to its rightful keeper. At last, Odysseus and Penelope stood face to face. The years had carved themselves into both, yet the bond between them endured, quiet as the roots of an ancient tree. Penelope, cautious and wise, tested him with questions, ensuring that this was no trick, no phantom conjured by longing. Only when he spoke of their bed, carved from the living trunk of an olive tree, did her heart yield. For this detail, rooted in memory, in intimacy, in the shared life that only they knew, proved beyond doubt that he was her husband, her companion, her long-lost king. Their reunion was not a blaze of passion but a deep exhale, a release of years of waiting. In their embrace, the long journey reached its true end, not in conquest or in wealth, but in the simple return to love, to home, to the quiet certainty of belonging. The tale of Odysseus does not end with grandeur, for myths endure not because of their victories, but because of their resonance with the human heart. His journey became more than one man's return. It became the story of longing, of resilience, of the bond between wanderer and home. For every listener through the ages, the Odyssey is not merely the tale of a Greek king, but the reflection of our own searches, our own trials, our own quiet hopes that, no matter how far we drift, there will always be a place where we belong, waiting for us with patient constancy. So the story closes gently, like the sea at twilight, its waves soft against the shore. The gods withdraw into silence, their part complete. The winds rest, the stars shine steadily overhead, and the house of Ithaca is quiet once more. Odysseus, at last at peace, lays aside the burdens of wandering. The myth, eternal in its telling, drifts onward through time, carried from one generation to the next, not as a storm, but as a lullaby, enduring and timeless. And so, as the listener drifts into sleep, the journey of Odysseus lingers only as a dream, gentle as the whisper of waves, eternal as the bond between home and heart.